Canada today will be done by the pages. Let the doors be opened.
You did a great job.
We have a point of order. The honourable member, or the honourable parliamentary secretary to the government house leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. There have been discussions amongst the parties, and if you seek it, I believe you will find the unanimous consent for the following motion. That notwithstanding any standing order, special order, or usual practice of the House, the recorded divisions on the motion to concur in the 14th report of the Standing Committee on Health, the second reading of Bill C-284, an act to establish a national strategy for eye care, the second reading of Bill S-202, an act to amend the Parliament of Canada Act, Parliamentary Visual Artist Laureate, and the third reading of Bill C-281, an act to amend the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development Act, the Justice for Victims of Corrupt Foreign Officials Act, Sergei Magnitsky Law, the Broadcasting Act, and the Prohibiting Cluster Munitions Act be held before the other recorded divisions deferred today.
All those opposed to the honourable member moving the motion will please say nay. Agreed. The House has agreed to the terms of the motion. All those opposed to the motion will please say nay. Carried. Statements by members. Déclaration de député. The honourable member for Brampton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, next week on June 16th and 17th, Mississauga Halal Food Festival will be held at the Mississauga Celebration Square. More than 20,000 members of the Muslim community come together from Brampton and the Greater Toronto area to attend this traditional event every year. This beautiful festival is a celebration of halal food and Muslim-owned small businesses, which bring together a wide range of cuisines, entertainment, and cultures representing the diversity of the nearly 2 million Canadian Muslims. This year, the Mississauga Halal Food Festival celebrates its 10th anniversary. Bravo. I applaud all the organizers, volunteers, small businesses, and sponsors ETA next weekend. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Bravo.
Today to recognize some well-deserving students from Bruce Grey Owen Sound who earned the right to participate in the Canada-wide Science Fair in Edmonton just a few weeks ago. Nearly 400 student finalists from across the country took part in this National Science Fair where they vied for over $2 million in scholarships and prizes. The 6 students from Blue Water District School Board did not disappoint. Proudly representing my riding were Lily Kennedy and Karis Curry of St. Mary's in Owen Sound with their project on harmonizing coffee senses. As well, Blake and Madeline Howes of John Diefenbaker Senior School in Hanover with their project titled The Science of Smiles, which earned them a Silver Excellence Award Medal, a University of Alberta scholarship worth $1,500, and a Western University scholarship worth an additional $2,000. Mr. Speaker, as someone with a science degree, I'm optimistic about what our youth have in store for the future of scientific discovery in Canada. Again, my congratulations to all those who participated in the Canada-wide Science Fair.
The honourable member for Fredericton.
Mr. Speaker, my intention today is to celebrate love in honor of Pride season, to share my appreciation for the 2S LGBTQI+ community and allies for their fight for human rights, for charter rights, and for who we are as a nation. Unfortunately, rights for queer and gender diverse people are under attack in communities around Canada, including in my home province of New Brunswick. Misinformed and homophobic comments are pervasive, and we are seeing a disturbing and dangerous rise in harassment, discrimination.
Interrupt a moment. Nous avons. Est-ce que la traduction?
Is the interpretation not working? All right. It's working now.
I'm going to have to ask the honourable member to start over. We had a bit of a translation problem. So the honourable member for Fredericton.
Mr. Speaker, my intention today is to celebrate love in honor of Pride season, to share my appreciation for the 2S LGBTQI+ community and allies for their fight for human rights, for charter rights, and for who we are as a nation. Unfortunately, rights for queer and gender diverse people are under attack in communities across Canada, including in my home province of New Brunswick. Misinformed and homophobic comments are pervasive. We are seeing a disturbing and dangerous rise in harassment, discrimination, and oppression, which have profound, life-threatening consequences. Nonsensical boycotts and demonstrations of hate threaten the very ability of gender diverse peoples to exist freely and without fear in public. There are real risks of setbacks, and for queer kids internalizing what they are hearing and seeing, who might believe that they cannot live as their true selves, love and be loved for who they are. It is harmful and it is wrong. Mr. Speaker, the hate is loud, but there are more of us who know that love will overcome. I ask that all members of this House stand up for Canada and stand up for Pride. Thank you.
L'honorable.
The honourable member for Berthier-Maskinongé. Mr. Speaker, before becoming the Member of Parliament for Berthier-Maskinongé, I taught high school for 25 wonderful years, during which I strived to teach economics, geography, and history, but above all, citizenship, Mr. Speaker. I tried to make my students aware of democracy and the fundamental role that they must play in it. And every year I organized a visit to the National Assembly of Quebec, Quebec's true parliament. So you can understand the emotion that I feel today as I welcome the first group of students from my old school, Les Rablières de Saint-Félix de Valois. I salute the young people who are here today, as well as Martin Lambert, Gilles Giguère, and Annie Gadouri, who continue the honorable mission of accompanying and training our young people. Who knows? Maybe the future president of Quebec is with us today. Welcome to Parliament Hill, and enjoy your visit. The honorable member for Sherbrooke. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Every day, we are losing more and more of our loved ones to the toxic drugs and overdose crisis. This week, the Minister of Mental Health and Addictions is in Washington to attend a trilateral public health summit, the North American Dialogue on Drugs, to discuss continued collaboration with the United States and Mexico to address the toxic drug and overdose crisis. They'll also discuss trilateral and international cooperation and the growing public health and safety challenges which are posed by synthetic drugs. To save more lives and to reduce the risks of substance use, we are sharing all of our tools, systems, and experience. Our government also announced new regulatory changes aimed at disrupting the illegal import and distribution of chemicals which are used to manufacture illegal fentanyl. We remain committed to advancing the 4 internationally recognized pillars of drug policy: prevention, harm reduction, treatment, and law enforcement, so that we can find a solution to this ongoing tragedy and save lives.
The honourable member for Bay of Quinte.
Mr. Speaker, a Liberal walks into a bar and says, "Drinks are on me. Who's paying?" Well, who's paying, Mr. Speaker, are Canadians. Canadians who are already paying double for mortgage and rent payments. Canadians who own businesses and farms who are struggling to keep their heads above water. Canadians who today are seeing another quarter-point interest rate hike because of this Liberal government's misspending, a 4.5% increase in only a year and a half. According to the IMF, Canada now runs the highest risk of missing mortgage payments among advanced economies. Remember, Mr. Speaker, when this Prime Minister said this government would take on debt so Canadians wouldn't have to? The solution seems to be simple, but this government just doesn't get it. Stop the inflationary spending, balance the budget, and lower taxes. It's closing time. The tab with the Spend EP is past due, and Canadians need a new Prime Minister, a Prime Minister with common sense who will look after the common sense of the common people. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Ottawa South.
Mr. Speaker, it's an honour to rise today to mark the 60th anniversary of St. Geneviève Parish in my riding of Ottawa South. The parish's history dates back to May 28, 1963, when Father Gaston Croteau was appointed founding priest. At that time, the parish met for Sunday Mass in the Mazenod Seminary Chapel on Smythe Road. By the end of July 1963, the parish had acquired land on which to build the church that we all know and love at the corner of Arch and Canterbury Streets. On this very joyous occasion, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the leaders, clergy, and volunteers, past and present, for all of their efforts and dedication as we gather to celebrate 60 years of faith, community, and fellowship in the parish of St. Geneviève. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Orléans.
Mr. Speaker, pride in Canada, countries like Uganda passed one of the toughest draconian laws in the world, making them the 12th country to enact the death penalty against LGBTQI persons. Today, Canada is honored to welcome Nobel Peace Prize nominee Dr. Frank Nushiga, Executive Director of SMUG, one of the leading human rights defenders in Uganda. He is with 5 parliamentarians who have bravely opposed this law. He is also joined with Dr. Kimali Powell, CEO of Rainbow Railroad, an international organization providing solutions for LGBTQI refugees. Mr. Speaker, to us, LGBTQI plus rights are human rights. Regardless of whom you love or who you are, no one should live in fear. Love is love is love. Canada will continue to stand up with the community, stand up for their rights, here at home and abroad. Happy Pride Month.
Bravo. The honourable member for Cumberland Colchester.
Mr. Speaker, this Liberal government's out-of-control spending leaves Canadians with the grim reality that money is tighter in their households every month. People in Cumberland Colchester have contacted me almost daily to express hopelessness and dismay as they watch prices and interest rates climb. Today's interest rate hike and its effect on mortgages will be disastrous. The hard work by Nova Scotians for the betterment of the country has been rewarded with 8 years of ridiculous inflationary spending, culminating sadly in the terrible budget that we see before the House now. The Liberals have now approved $60 billion in new inflationary spending, more weight on the backs of Canadian families and businesses. These are people with hopes and dreams that cannot be achieved because of the Liberal out-of-control spending. The madness needs to stop now. The Liberals must give us a plan to end these inflationary deficits in spending, to bring down inflation and interest rates so Canadians can thrive in this country again. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Brampton South.
Mr. Speaker, today I rise to speak on a matter that impacts women's participation in politics. In a few moments, we will begin question period. And Mr. Speaker, it is likely that you will need to remind members repeatedly not to shout across the aisle while another member is speaking. The culture of heckling and disruption within this chamber continues to undermine the meaningful participation of women in politics. It is time for us to acknowledge this concern and take necessary measures to build more gender-sensitive parliaments. Yesterday, I met with the first group of Equal Voice Campaign School program, helping women build skills they need to run for office. Equal Voice calls upon the House to end gender-based heckling and personal attacks in this chamber. So today, let's set an example and build an environment that encourages everyone to participate in politics without fear or intimidation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Kelowna Lake Country.
46% of Canadians say they are in worse shape financially than they were last June, according to a new Angus Reid poll. And 3 in 10 people are struggling to get by. Meanwhile, 54% of renters and 45% of mortgage holders say they are finding their monthly payments for housing either tough or very difficult to manage. This morning, the Bank of Canada raised interest rates again in an attempt to slow Liberal made-in-Canada inflation. Yet this Liberal budget will continue to cause high inflation, keeping interest rates high, squeezing families with several tax increases, has no plan to balance in the years to come, and adds more than $60 billion in new spending, which will cost $4,200 per family. Canadians cannot afford the Liberals' inflationary deficits as food, housing, and personal debt have all hit record highs. The Prime Minister must give Canadians a plan to end inflationary deficits, to bring down inflation and interest rates. And if he won't, a Conservative government will.
Full member for Hastings, Lennox and Addington.
Mr. Speaker, for months, the Conservative opposition has called on this government to demonstrate even a modicum of financial management capacity and address the rampant government spending. Our calls continue to fall on the willfully deaf ears of this government. Steeped in a culture of complacency, they continue to dodge accountability, even as news comes out about interest rates going up again today. Higher deficits means higher inflation, which means higher interest rates, which means Canadians cannot afford to pay their bills. Today, we are continuing to block the Liberal budget until the government ends inflationary deficits and spending to bring down inflation and interest rates. Mr. Speaker, today, we are putting the Tory in dilatory.
That's right.
The honourable member for Mississauga, Erin Mills.
Mr. Speaker, today I stand to recognize and celebrate the remarkable journey of HCL Tech in Canada. Over the past 14 years, HCL Tech has made significant contributions to Canada's technology sector and has become one of the leading global technology firms operating in our country. HCL Tech's mission to bring together the best of technology and people has helped them prove themselves as a socially responsible company committed to driving innovation and creating employment opportunities for Canadians. I'm proud of our Liberal government that wholeheartedly supports and values the contributions of companies like HCL Tech, which is why we have created the Canadian Innovation Corporation to drive economic growth and investments in Canada. HCL Tech's presence reinforces Canada's position as a global hub for innovation and excellence. Their dedication to technology, people, and corporate social responsibility serves as an inspiration to us all. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I'm going to ask everyone to take a deep breath. There's some people giving statements. I just want to make sure that everyone gets the chance to hear them. It's nice to see both sides getting along. Just go over one side or the other and talk to each other so you're whispering to each other, not talking out loud. The honourable member for Vancouver East.
The hotel workers of Radisson Blu, formerly Pacific Gateway, held a rally on the 2-year anniversary of their strike, the longest strike ever in this industry. The employer used COVID-19 as an excuse and terminated 143 racialized women, 70% of their workers. Shame. Some have worked there for over 40 years. They are the backbone of the hotel. Let's not kid ourselves. The employer wanted new workers because those workers will be at the bottom of the wage grid. The owner wanted to turn a bigger profit at the expense of the workers. This is the same owner who got 30 $33 million in federal contracts as a COVID quarantine facility. It is shameful. The Canadian Labour Congress and the BC Federation of Labour have issued a boycott of the hotel. I ask all members of the House to stand with Unite Here Local 40 workers and their call to hire back the workers and agree to a fair contract.
The Honourable Member for Beloeil-Chambly. Mr. Speaker, Quebec is once again Canada's hockey champion. And so congratulations to the Remparts de Québec, who won the Memorial Cup on Sunday by a score of 5-0. The Red Devils ended their season right at the top after having won all of Quebec. Congratulations to the organization and the full team, and with a particular mention to my two favorite team members as member for Beloeil-Chambly, Richelieu's Nathan Gaucher and Beloeil's Michael Huchette. Their hard work and their victorious season is a source of pride and inspiration for the entire region. Congratulations to Patrick Roy, who, after over 500 victories and 2 Memorial Cups, can leave with his head held high if he so desires. And at some point, we're going to have to recognize that it's in the arenas of our league in Quebec that we see the best junior hockey in North America and probably the best in the world. Go Remparts, go.
The Honourable Member for Calgary, Forest Lawn.
Canadians go broke. 8 years of out-of-control spending has led to a nation of high inflation, high interest rates, and higher taxes. 1 in 5 Canadians are skipping meals. 9 in 10 young people have given up on the dream of home ownership. Liberals threw $60 billion of fuel on the inflationary fire they started with their recently failed budget. Former Liberal Finance Minister John Manley said Liberal spending is like keeping your foot on the gas while the Bank of Canada keeps its foot on the brake. Today, we see the direct result of this never-ending fiscal policy failure as the Bank of Canada raised its interest rate again for the 9th time in just over a year. That's 19 times higher to a level not seen in over 20 years. This is devastating for homeowners and renters, already struggling with double mortgages and rent payments. Liberals are out of touch and Canadians are out of money and homes. Conservatives will bring home lower prices, powerful paychecks, and homes Canadians can afford. Only Conservatives will restore affordability with common sense for the common people. Now let's bring it home.
Hey! The Honourable Member for Parkdale High Park.
Speaker, today in Ottawa we welcome a group of kids from Parkdale Public School in my riding of Parkdale High Park. They've come here as part of a program I started prior to COVID called Pathways to Parliament. The idea is to bring a set of diverse young people to Ottawa, kids that are newcomers, whose circumstances might mean that they might not otherwise have the opportunity to visit these hallowed halls. And the idea is to expose these young people to government, to our Parliament, and to various parliamentarians. The hope is that they might learn, that they might be impressed, or even inspired, Mr. Speaker, inspired by seeing that Canada's Parliament in 2023 looks just like they do. A diverse assemblage of people of different races, different backgrounds, different cultures, and different religions. I want to thank their teachers, Hassan and Sandra, and Principal Diane Brown, for committing to this important initiative. And to these 10 youngsters, I say merci, shukran, tujiche, and thank you. Thank you for being here, but most of all, thank you for seeing yourselves here. Merci.
Oral questions. Question orale. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Today, there's once again a human tragedy underway because of huge and apparently unpredictable increases in interest rates that will force Canadians to sell their homes or to default upon their payments. The Prime Minister promised that interest rates would remain low for a long time, but the government's expenditures have forced inflation up, and therefore the Bank of Canada had to increase interest rates. What increase will the average family see in its mortgage payments in the next 3 years? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Over the past few months, I've spoken to many Canadians who shared their concerns with me with regard to the cost of living and their worries about global inflation or their worries about the economic situation in which we are today. Of course, the Bank of Canada continues to do its work, but we will also continue to do our work with a number of non-inflationary measures that will help Canadian families, help for dental care for kids, working for low-income workers, investments for groceries. The Leader of the Official Opposition, the Governor of the Bank of Canada, indicated that this government's deficits are increasing inflation. The former Minister for Finance, the former Liberal Minister, stated that this Prime Minister's inflationary policies is putting the foot on the accelerator. It's hitting the gas for inflation, whilst the Bank of Canada is trying to hit the brakes. Mr. Speaker, we have the highest household debt level in G7 countries. Canadians can no longer pay for these deficits. Will he say at least what increase will be seen in mortgage payments in the next 3 years? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we know that Canadians are facing difficult times, and that is exactly the reason for which this government is here to invest to help them in a targeted and non-inflationary way. The Conservative Party insists that we should send less assistance for low-income earners, less help for dental care for those who need it, less help for families with young children in daycare. We will continue to be here to help Canadians weather these difficult storms, because that is our job. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Sucker punch. That's what Canadians received from this Prime Minister. He promised them low interest rates for long. He said debt was without consequence and that the budget would balance itself. None of those things came true, and interest rates are now 19 times higher than they were a year ago. The Governor of the Bank of Canada, the former Liberal Finance Minister, countless other experts agree that the Prime Minister's deficits are ballooning inflation and therefore interest rates. Families have to plan their finances. So will he indicate how much will the average family see their monthly mortgage payments go up over the next 3 years? How much?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, while the Bank of Canada continues to do its job to drive down inflation, which is going down, we will continue to do our job to be there to support Canadians who need it, with investments in things like dental care, in a grocery rebate, in supports for low-income renters, and the kinds of things that Conservatives would be cutting instead. Canadians are hurting, and the Conservatives' answer is cuts to programs, cuts to supports for families, cuts to Canadians at a time they need it. Austerity is not the answer, Mr. Speaker. Responsible fiscal approach is. That's exactly what we're doing by supporting Canadians who need it.
Hear, hear. Leader of the Opposition.
Actually, austerity is exactly what Canadians are feeling in their household budgets today, while the government budgets overflow with abundance. Mr. Speaker, there's already been a 16% year-over-year increase in the number of Canadians missing their mortgage payments. After 8 years of this Prime Minister, we have the highest household debt in the entire G7. Household debt is now 7% higher than our entire GDP, Mr. Speaker. And now his inflationary deficits are shooting up interest rates. So how much will the average family have to plan to pay more in mortgage payments per month?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Straight, Mr. Speaker. Canada has the best debt-to-GDP ratio in the G7. We have the lowest deficit in the G7, but the Leader of the Opposition wants us to do far less to support Canadians who need it right now. That's exactly backwards, Mr. Speaker. His pursuit of ideological gains is hurting Canadians. We are going to continue to be there in responsible, targeted ways, keeping our fiscal responsibility at the center of what we do while we support Canadians in targeted, non-inflationary ways. That's what Canadians need right now.
Hear, hear. Well, Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, it's not just me anymore pointing out that deficits drive inflation. It's Liberals. It's the former Liberal Finance Minister, John Manley, who said that The Liberal deficits are a bit like driving your car with one foot on the gas and the other on the brake, generally, especially if there's slushy conditions under your tires, end quote. He's pointing out that this Prime Minister presses his foot on the inflationary gas pedal while the Bank of Canada has to press on the brakes. The engine is eventually going to blow. We know Canadians cannot pay their bills. Will the Prime Minister be honest today and tell Canadians how much their mortgage payments will go up because of these rate hikes?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Let's use a specific example of what the Leader of the Opposition calls inflationary spending. We made a decision that kids under 12 in this country shouldn't have to pay for dental care. Their families should be able to send them to the dentists. Well, Mr. Speaker, the Conservative politicians who all have access to dental care through the House of Commons supports for their kids don't think Canadians who can't afford to send their kids to the dentist should be doing that, and they say that's inflationary. Mr. Speaker, that approach around cuts and austerity is not what Canadians need.
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly, Mr. Speaker. I ask the Prime Minister to listen. The Special Rapporteur that chose himself had to admit to a parliamentary committee that he tabled a report that contradicts testimony from a parliamentarian who was victim of intimidation and interference from China. He said that he drafted the report based on what he knew when he wrote it. He also had to admit that his report, therefore, was incomplete. A crucial report for the safety of Canadians and parliamentarians in the country. The writer now says that it is incomplete. The report is perhaps also biased, we've been told. Does the Prime Minister agree to put an end to Mr. Johnston's mandate? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we all know that the Leader of the Bloc Québécois won't accept any answer I give today. But he has the opportunity of reading the answers himself. He has the opportunity to accept a briefing from our intelligence officers that will clarify all the thought process behind the former Governor General's report. The Leader of the Bloc, like the Leader of the Conservatives, refuses to accept these top-secret briefings in order to understand the issue at hand, and that is subjacent to our concerns. The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly. I refuse to see in secret what should be seen by everyone. Mr. Speaker, what I propose to the Prime Minister is a truce. If Parliament were to appoint an independent commissioner that would decide what is public or not, then we could move on to something else. However, we'll have to continue to ask relentlessly what justifies a Prime Minister keeping in position a rapporteur who's his friend, a rapporteur who has admitted that the report is incomplete. He didn't speak to the chief electoral officer, and he didn't speak to the Chinese diaspora. The Right Honourable Prime Minister. The Leader of the Bloc Québécois has just said that he refuses to see in secret what should be published. Now, I understand that he's devoted to his position in the opposition and he doesn't expect to govern anything in his life, but as a leader, as a parliamentarian, he should understand that his responsibility is to serve Canadians. And it gives him the opportunity, if not the responsibility, to go to the very depths of what he can do. When it comes to national security, there are reasons for which certain things are secret and reasons why we have to be discreet. He has the opportunity to get this information himself. The Honourable Member for Burnaby South. Quite ironically, today is Clean Air Day, and Canada is burning. The air quality caused by forest fires is a danger for people with respiratory problems, for children and for pregnant women. We know that with global warming, we are going to see ever more forest fires. What will it take for the Prime Minister to finally realise that we have to act right now in order to save our environment? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I completely agree that today is a day of irony because we are Clean Air Day. It is Clean Air Day here in Canada. We see how these forest fires can affect us. Historic forest fires affect us. They will not be the worst to come. We know that it will get worse in the years to come. Here we are still having debate with the Conservative Party, notably, whether yes or not we should act in order to fight against climate change, instead of how we can actually fight against climate change. The government will continue to fight against climate change and will continue to protect Canadians.
It's clear this government has not taken the climate crisis seriously. Their actions show that very clearly. Today is supposed to be Clean Air Day, and at the same time, our country is burning. You can even smell the smoke in this chamber. Our country is literally on fire, and this Liberal government thinks that business as usual is fine. And we've got a Conservative government that's a Conservative Party that's in full denial mode. When will this Prime Minister realize we have to take this crisis seriously? We've got to protect our environment. We've got to protect the air for our kids, for our future.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, not only are we the government that has done more to fight climate change than any previous government in history, independent expert evaluators judged our environmental plan in the last election as being significantly stronger even than the NDP's environmental plan. Unfortunately, we're caught in a debate where Conservatives are still arguing whether or not we should be fighting climate change instead of contributing to a debate around how to best fight climate change. We've put forward a price on pollution that is changing corporate behaviors and driving down emissions. Conservatives stand against it, but they don't have anything to offer.
The Honourable Member for Brantford Brant.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday David Johnston, the loyal rapporteur of this Prime Minister, his ski buddy, his cottage neighbour, his dinner companion, and member of the Trudeau Foundation, was incapable of seeing any conflict of interest. Now, I can understand why our ethically challenged Prime Minister would be oblivious to this, but for a lawyer, law professor, and dean of a law school, this is nothing but willful blindness. David Johnston has lost the trust of Parliament and Canadians. It's time to end the sham. When will this Prime Minister show Mr. Johnston the door and call for a public inquiry?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let me quote. I think we're dealing in the former Governor General with a very credible individual, and I think that distant history bears little relevance to the fact that he has a very distinguished career. If we're suggesting just because at some point in history he was appointed by a former Conservative Prime Minister that he should be disqualified from participating in public life, I think that's a bit extreme. This is a very qualified individual, and frankly, I haven't heard anybody question his integrity, and I have no reason to do so. That, Mr. Speaker, was the Leader of the Opposition, the member for Carleton.
The Honourable Member for Wellington Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, the Special Rapporteur's mandate is all about Beijing's interference in our electoral process. In Canada, we have only one federal electoral process. We have only one democratic institution, and that is the election of members to this House of Commons. And 3 times in the past 3 months, this House has voted for an independent public inquiry. Yet the Special Rapporteur and the Prime Minister alone have rejected an inquiry. How can confidence and trust be restored in our democracy if the Prime Minister and government continue to defy the democratic will of this House?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, I agree entirely with the member opposite that this is a very serious situation which we are facing. Unfortunately, the leader of the Conservative Party is not taking this seriously. The Conservative Party is looking for occasions to make personal attacks and toxic partisan attacks instead of actually looking at the question of foreign interference with the level of responsibility necessary. If the Leader of the Opposition was serious about that, he would accept the top secret briefings from our intelligence agencies that explain the underpinnings of the conclusions in the Johnston report, and he would be able to weigh in responsibly.
Hear, hear. The Honourable Member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Prime Minister's loyal rapporteur was asked to reconcile his conclusion that the spreading of disinformation in the 2021 election could not be attributed to the Beijing regime with the CSIS briefing to the former leader of the Conservative Party that said the opposite. The rapporteur said that he based his conclusion on evidence that he had at the time. evidence that was provided by this government. So, did the rapporteur ignore material evidence, or did this government withhold it from him? Which one is it?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, that evidence is available to the Leader of the Opposition if only he were to accept a top-secret briefing that he prefers to refuse so he can continue his baseless personal attacks against an eminent Canadian. But further than that, Mr. Speaker, it is a panel of expert public service officials who determined both in 2019 and 2021 that the election integrity held, mechanisms that this government put in place that previous governments never bothered with. That's how we know the integrity of the elections in 2019 and 2021 held.
That's right. The honourable member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Mr. Speaker, a report of the government's rapid response mechanism identified that Beijing-controlled social media accounts were spreading disinformation in the 2021 election targeting the Conservative Party, including an account with 26 million followers. And yet, incredibly, the rapporteur concluded otherwise. He ignored the report, he ignored the evidence, and instead whitewashed Beijing's interference. The conclusions of a rapporteur have no credibility. Will the Prime Minister fire him and finally call an independent public inquiry?
To your right, Honourable Prime Minister.
These are the conclusions of the top public officials who had the task during the 2021 and 2019 elections to monitor the foreign interference that has been ongoing in this country for years and years, against with the former Minister of Elections for the Conservatives, the current leader, did nothing. We established a protocol whereby the integrity of those elections were evaluated and reported on. That integrity held. Now, if the Conservatives think the integrity of the elections didn't hold in 19 or 21, let them say so, Mr. Speaker.
That's right.
The honourable member for Mégantic-l'Érable. The Prime Minister's good friend closed his eyes on crucial information to avoid having to make a recommendation that there should be a public and transparent inquiry. He did not talk to the Chief Electoral Officer. He didn't talk to the MP for Don Valley West. He didn't read a CSIS report sent to the member for Durham. No reports on various links to the CCP. Nothing about Beijing's police stations. Nothing about the Trudeau Foundation. After this terribly partisan demonstration, the Prime Minister finally announced today that there will be a public and independent inquiry. The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the Conservative Party just wants to carry out personal attacks against the former Governor-General, who was appointed by Stephen Harper at the time. He wants to carry out partisan attacks to score political points. But the reality of the matter is that if the Conservatives really wanted to take the issue seriously, that everyone should take seriously, then the Conservatives would accept the top-secret briefing that was offered to the leader of the official opposition so that they can understand the facts behind the decisions that have been made by the former Governor-General, the honourable member for Mégantic-l'Érable. If the Prime Minister was serious, he would listen to the majority of MPs in this House, Mr. Speaker. David Johnston had one thing to do to convince Canadians, to show that there is absolutely no conflict of interest between him and the Prime Minister. He completely failed by confirming every single conflicts of interest that would make him ineligible to receive the trust of this House and of Canadians. When will the Prime Minister finally do the honourable thing and put an end to the pains of his friend, the former Governor-General, by allowing him to step down? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. As was recently explained in newspapers, the best way to hamper an inquiry is to discredit the inquirers and the investigators. That is what the official opposition is doing. But it's not the Conservatives who invented this. This is a tactic directly from the playbook of Donald Trump. They're tackling investigators because they don't want to talk about the actual facts and the serious conclusions of the matter. To take this more seriously is what we all have to do and what we expect from the official opposition. The Honourable Member for Baillieu-Chambly. Mr. Speaker, whilst the Prime Minister continues to protect Liberal secrets and Liberal powers, he is not protecting Canadians and people who have been oppressed by the Chinese regime. People that are threatened in China as a way to pressure Canadians. He's doing nothing on the matter this morning. Representatives from Taiwan, from the Uyghur Autonomous Territory, from Solomon Islands and Tibet asked for a public inquiry. Will the Prime Minister finally act like a head of state and accept this public inquiry? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. We know full well that the first targets of Chinese interference the first targets are the diaspora. That's why we'll defend these communities, and they are at the heart of the decisions that we are making. I look forward to see the work done by the Governor-General throughout Canada so that he can talk to various diasporas, so that he can make recommendations to the government so that we can continue to protect them. Unfortunately, there is more and more intolerance and racism since the pandemic, and that is why we will continue to be here for these vulnerable people. The Honourable Member for Baillieu-Chambly. Mr. Speaker, it's not a diaspora. These are conquered people, or people who are being conquered. There's a very dangerous file. There should be a true independent commissioner. I don't want to be part of any Liberal manoeuvre that allows the government to keep things secret, and that means that Canadians would not get all the information they deserve to see. I will not be part of a system that will abandon people to the oppression of Beijing and that does not protect Canada and Canada's democracy. Will the Prime Minister accept my proposal? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the member knows full well that there are elements of national security that cannot be disclosed to the greater public, and that's the reality of life. There are people that work for the army, for CSIS, who jeopardize their own lives to unveil the secrets of countries that wish us harm. We have the leader of the Bloc Québécois, who could consult secret information to better understand what we can't publish, and he refuses to read this report. He prefers ignorance rather than facts. Now, I would like to remind the member for Lac-Saint-Jean that if he shouts in the ears of the member of Baillieu-Chambly, then the latter won't be able to hear the answer. Just a little reminder.
Asked by my associate finance shadow minister if deficits had been smaller, would inflation have been lower? And the Bank of Canada president answered, governor answered, yes. He also said inflation in Canada is increasingly reflecting what's happening in Canada. Former Liberal Premier of Nova Scotia said, on the inflation side, if governments both nationally and subnationally continue to spend beyond their means, spending to pay the credit card of the government of today, they are going to continue to have inflation that continues to increase. If he won't believe me, will he at least believe his officials and his Liberal friends?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I believe this is the first time we've heard the Leader of the Opposition even indirectly criticize provincial governments that are racking up significant spending that is inflationary. On the federal side, we have been very cautious about targeting the measures so that they are not contributing to inflation, even as we continue to support Canadians, to support families, to support seniors, to support workers, with measures that, on top of that, the Leader of the Opposition is excited about filibustering and blocking tonight. Mr. Speaker, we're going to be there to help low-income workers despite their political games.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, it's not just the Governor of the Bank of Canada who says deficits contribute to inflation. It's not just the former Liberal Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister John Manley who says that deficits contribute to inflation. It's his own actual Finance Minister and Deputy Prime Minister. She said that deficits pour fuel on the inflationary fire. And that's exactly what she did with this budget. $60 billion in additional inflation. That's $4,200 per family, which now has led to higher interest rates. will he announce a plan and a deadline to balance the budget to bring down inflation and interest rates?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Bank of Canada is acting to bring down inflation, and it's working. Our inflation is coming down. At the same time, our job as a government is to be there to support Canadians, to be there with supports for families, be there with supports for kids who need dental care, be there for supports for Canadians who are struggling right now. The Conservative approach is to cut programs, to cut supports for Canadians, at the same time as we are standing up to help Canadians through this difficult time and out to the other side.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, it's clear that the Prime Minister's staff handed him a stale briefing note because inflation is actually rising. It was up in the most recent reported month. Just so happens that that month followed the introduction of the $60 billion of brand new, above and beyond inflationary spending by this minister. We now know that deficits contribute to inflation, which raise interest rates. And he's right, the Bank of Canada is trying to bring down that inflation while he continues to pour the gas on the fire. Will he stop that irresponsible practice and deliver a balanced budget to bring down inflation and interest rates?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, at least the Leader of the Opposition is consistent in not letting facts get in the way of a good political argument, whether it's on climate change, whether it's on foreign interference, or whether it's on the Bank of Canada and inflation. He's continuing to fearmonger. He's continuing to amplify erroneous fears that Canadians have, at the same time as we are delivering supports in a targeted way. We have the lowest deficit of any G7 country. We have the lowest debt to GDP ratio of any G7 country. We are continuing to be there for Canadians in a non-inflationary way that is targeted and right.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Erroneous fears? Wow. Mr. Speaker, tonight, families will sit down with their kids at their dining room table to say, sorry, we have to sell the house. Yeah. Because mortgage payments are going to go up by as much as $1,500 per month. That's not me. That's according to the Bank of Canada, which predicts a 40% increase in mortgage payments. People can't pay $15,000 more in mortgage payments. They have only $200 left in the bank at the end of the month. Will the Prime Minister acknowledge that these are real fears by real people and stand on their side?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, where the Leader of the Opposition falls down is his solution for those families is to do less for them, to take away their child care, to take away their dental care, to take away the programs that are helping them, like the Canada Workers Benefit. We are bringing forward payments for the Canada Workers Benefit so that low-income workers can get more help right now, and that leader is going to stand up for hours tonight and block that measure, Mr. Speaker. There is help for Canadians on the way, and those Conservatives are standing in the way with silly procedural games.
The Honourable Member for Burnaby South.
Today marks the 9th rate increase since March 2020.
It's starting to get noisy again. I'm going to ask everyone to take a deep breath and just quiet down. I'm going to ask the Honourable Member for Burnaby South to start from the top.
Today marks the 9th interest rate increase since March 2022. For families on a stretched budget, this means a lot more pain. But more and more economists have come to the consensus, something that neither Conservatives nor the Liberals are willing to talk about, that the greed of CEOs exploiting this inflationary crisis to jack up profits is the major cause of inflation. So will this Prime Minister finally take greedflation seriously and stop greedy CEOs from gouging Canadians?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the global inflation crisis that faces Canadians and people around the world has global roots, whether it's the war in Ukraine that Putin is responsible for, whether it's coming out of the pandemic. We can say that Canada's economic recovery has been much faster than it was during the much shallower recession in 2008 under the previous government, that employment is up higher than it's ever been. But at the same time, too many Canadians are hurting, and that's why we've been stepping up with targeted supports that aren't increasing inflation, but are responding to the reality of Canadians who are struggling.
The honourable member for Burnaby South.
My question was about greedflation, and again, the Liberals and the Conservatives, neither of them have the courage to talk about it. En ces temps difficiles, les économies.
During this difficult time, economists are warning that interest rate hikes could lead Canada to a recession. With yet another increase, people will have even more trouble making ends meet every month. Meanwhile, multinationals and grocery giants like Metro are raking in the profits. Will the Prime Minister finally tax excessive profits that are being made by his billionaire friends? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we all know that Canadians are facing challenges, financial challenges, and that is why we are taking action. We are taking action to support them with investments like the grocery rebate, with assistance for low-income workers, and assistance for low-income renters, dental care for families that can't send their kids to the dentist. We are there with targeted non-inflationary assistance. We are helping people while the Conservatives are once again pushing austerity.
Lakeshore.
Mr. Speaker, as Canada continues to recover from the pandemic, it's important to make sure that no one is left behind. That's why our government has introduced programs like the Canada Child Benefit, $10 a day child care, the Canada Dental Benefit, and the grocery rebate. With us today in Ottawa are a group of single moms and their daughters from my riding in Mississauga Lakeshore. They're some of the millions of Canadians who have benefited from these programs. I'm proud that our government has delivered real action for families in my community. Unfortunately, the official opposition refused to support these measures that help Canadians get ahead. Can the Prime Minister please remind this House why it's important to help make life more affordable for families?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, I want to thank the member for Mississauga Lakeshore for his question and his dedication to his constituents. We're all extremely proud of the accomplishments we've made since 2015, but we know there's a lot more to do. That's why our budget aims to make life more affordable for the middle class while creating great middle-class jobs in a clean economy. However, Conservative politicians continue to block us from delivering these important measures. We hope they'll end their partisan games and help us send the BIA to the Senate this week.
Hear, hear. The Leader of the Opposition.
After 8 years of this Prime Minister, he's not only doubled the national debt, adding more debt than all Prime Ministers combined, he's overseen a doubling in the average cost of rent, the average mortgage payment, and the average necessary down payment. Now, household debt in Canada is the worst of any country in the G7. In fact, our household debt in total is 7% bigger than the entire GDP of the country, and the IMF reports that we have the largest risk of mass defaults of all leading economies. Will the Prime Minister stop heaping on inflation and interest rate hikes now?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, the Canadian government has the lowest deficit in the G7, the best debt-to-GDP ratio in the G7, and yet Canadians are struggling. And we propose to send them more direct help, including with an ability to discount, to get tax refunds on their tools for tradespeople, help with the Canada Workers Benefit, other measures to help homebuyers. And Conservatives say no, we should be cutting programs. We should be sending less help to Canadians during this time. It's completely illogical and irresponsible, and yet they're standing up and blocking our budget.
That's right. The Leader of the Opposition.
He's not sending any help. Everything he spends, he has to take. It reminds us of when he said he was going to take on government debt so that Canadians wouldn't have to. Well, now they're stuck with twice the national government debt and the biggest household debt of any country in the G7. At the time, the Prime Minister flooded the economy with cheap cash, which increased housing prices and therefore mortgage debt. Now Canadians have more debt than at any time in our history, more debt than the size of our entire economy, and they're hit with a 19-fold increase in interest rates. How will they ever pay their bills?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, for every now and then, for the Conservative leader to remind us all that he wouldn't have been there to help Canadians through the depths of the pandemic. He wouldn't have been there to support families or small businesses or get our economy rolling again. He was part of the Stephen Harper government that let the 2008 pandemic linger for 9 years before we recovered jobs, and yet this deeper recession had 2 years to bounce back to full employment. We are going to continue to be there for Canadians, to support them, while he's proposing cuts and less support for Canadians when they need it most.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
We were the last to go in and the first to come out of the great global recession. We left the country with a balanced budget, and housing costs were half of what they are today, and not to mention that food price inflation never went above 4%. That is a far superior record to what this Prime Minister has delivered. He's doubled housing prices, doubled the cost of a mortgage, doubled rent costs, sent 1.5 million people running to the food bank, and now he proposes another $60 billion of inflationary deficits or $4,200 in extra cost to Canadians. Will he do what he promised to do just 6 months ago and give a date for a balanced budget?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, 2.7 million Canadians lifted out of poverty since 2015 because of supports and investments this government made, at the same time as we've seen millions of jobs created and the lowest unemployment in generations. The fact is, Mr. Speaker, we're going to continue to be there in targeted, non-inflationary ways to help Canadians, while the Conservatives continue to stand in the way of more help to Canadian families who need it right now. We have an approach that is growing the economy, creating great jobs, and supporting Canadians at the same time.
Hear, hear. Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
There he goes again, totally out of touch. Says Canadians have never had it so good. Those 9 in 10 young people who have given up on ever owning a home, they've never had it so good, says the Prime Minister. The 1.5 million who are going to food banks or skipping meals, they've never had it so good. Those that are going to the Mississauga Food Bank seeking help with medical assistance and dying not because they're sick but because they're hungry have never had it so good. What they are experiencing is the unavoidable mathematics of an inflationary government, which has spilled $500 billion of inflation on their backs. When will they balance the budget to bring down those costs?
Before getting, I just want to remind the honourable members, just because they change sides and go to another part of the room doesn't mean I can't hear them. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is we all in this House, representing constituents across the country, know that Canadians are hurting. The difference between our two approaches is we continue to be there in targeted, non-inflationary ways to help Canadians, while Conservatives are proposing program cuts, support cuts, cuts to child care, cuts to investments in dental care, cuts to the kinds of things that are helping Canadians through these difficult times. That's the choice Canadians are going to be making in a few years, between cuts and further responsible growth for the economy.
L'honorable député de Trois-Rivières.
The Honourable Member for Trois-Rivières. Yesterday, at the Committee on Chinese Interference, David Johnston confirmed that he based his report on only partial information. He didn't even take the time to speak to the Chief Electoral Officer or the Elections Commissioner. He didn't do the work he should have done, but he still concluded that we didn't need a public inquiry. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Johnston showed himself that his report was lacking in rigor and that his conclusions should be questioned. He himself discredited his own report. He disqualified himself from participating in future hearings. Will the Prime Minister finally dismiss him? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I have already answered this question. The Bloc Québécois is continuing its personal partisan attacks. we will take a moment to recognize all the firefighters and other first responders who are fighting the fires in Quebec and elsewhere. We are seeing the worst year for fires impacting communities and people throughout the country. We will continue to be there. Today, ironically, is Clean Air Day. We will continue to be there to fight climate change and to protect Canadians in every necessary way. The Honourable Member for Laurentides-Labelle. Mr. Speaker, it's very hard to get the truth about the matter of foreign interference. The Prime Minister is refusing to tell the truth. He is trying to drag opposition leaders into his secrets. And, most shocking of all, David Johnston admitted that he also didn't have access to the whole truth before concluding that we don't need a public inquiry. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has two options. He either dismisses Mr. Johnston and seriously considers a public inquiry, or he confirms that the entire process is an attempt to hide the truth. Which will he choose? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I have already answered this question. I spoke to Premier Legault this weekend and mayors of various communities and Indigenous communities in Quebec affected by the forest fires. And I would like to reassure them that the Canadian Armed Forces will continue to be there for Quebecers who fear for their lives, for their homes, their communities. We will be there and continue to work closely with the provincial government on Canadians' priorities and Quebecers' priorities, people who are watching their country burn. We will continue to fight climate change and talk about what really matters.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
After 8 years of this Prime Minister, the debt level for our families is the highest in the G7. The International Monetary Fund has indicated that Canada is facing the highest risk among developed countries when it comes to mortgage defaults. The Prime Minister is causing interest rates to go up due to his inflationary policies. He is forcing the Bank of Canada to increase rates. What will he do to turn around these inflationary policies and reduce interest rates before Canadians lose their homes? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the Government of Canada is in a responsible fiscal situation, but Canadians are suffering. Meanwhile, what the Conservative Party is proposing is austerity and cuts to programs that serve and help Canadians who are suffering in order to preserve the federal government's fiscal capacity, but preserve it for when Canadians need help now. That is why we are investing to help families, to help seniors, to help workers, and we will continue to be there for people in a responsible and non-inflationary fashion.
Mr. Speaker, we don't need another drama performance, because at the end of the day, when theatrics collides with mathematics, the math always wins. And after 8 years of this Prime Minister, the Canadians have a stock of combined debt that is bigger than our entire GDP. In fact, we are the most indebted families of any country in the G7. The IMF says that Canada is the #1 at-risk country for mass mortgage defaults. Will he reverse his inflationary and high interest rate policies before people go broke?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I've answered this question a few times, but the Leader of the Opposition continues to ask it because he refuses to go outside and see what is actually happening in Canada. Forest fires are raging. It's the worst year on record for forest fires already, but the fact is they are going to get worse in the coming years because climate change is real. And yet the Conservative Party continues to stand against the climate action that we've been taking, stand against the investments that we're making to support families, to support first responders. They continue to stand against help for Canadians who are losing their homes, losing their families, losing their livelihood.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
has he really sunk into the low of exploiting these fires for political gain to distract from his inflationary and high interest rate policies? Is that what it's come to? That he's so ashamed of his economic policy and record?
I'm going to have to interrupt this because I'm getting noise from both sides. I know you can handle it. You do that well. But what I need to have is I want to hear what's being said, and I'm sure both sides want to hear what's being said. I'm going to ask him to start from the top, please.
Mr. Speaker, this Prime Minister has just lowered himself to the worst steps to try and distract from his disastrous economic record. He's now using the forest fires to change the channel. This is even lower than I would have expected from him. Mr. Speaker, Canadians are going to sit down tonight to discuss how they're going to move into a small apartment because they're going to have to give up their homes after his inflationary policies have driven up interest rates on Canadian mortgage holders who have record debt. Will the Prime Minister keep the promise he made 6 months ago to balance the budget and bring down inflation and interest rates before folks go broke?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I've answered that question a dozen times, and for the Leader of the Opposition to consider that the forest fires that are taking people from their communities and destroying their homes are a mere distraction and not top of mind for people from coast to coast to coast is shameful. But the fact of the matter is he doesn't have anything to say about that because he refuses to put forward any real plan to fight against climate change, and he does nothing but fight against our plan to fight climate change. If he has a better plan, let him say it, because we've been waiting a long time for it. But he has no plan to fight climate change. He still questions whether it exists while Canada is burning.
L'honorable député de Madawaska-Restigouche.
The Honourable Member for Madawaska-Restigouche.
Order. Order. Okay, can we continue? Order. 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 L'honorable député de Madawaska.
The Honourable Member for Madawaska-Restigouche. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Canada is recognized for its rich biodiversity, but we know that both in Canada and elsewhere, climate change is undermining global biodiversity. This is Environment Week. I would ask the Prime Minister to tell us what his government is doing to protect flora, fauna, and Canadian biodiversity. The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member for Madawaska-Restigouche for this important question and his hard work. Canada has committed to meeting its objective of preserving 25% of our lands and oceans by 2025 and 30% by 2030. The Kunming-Montreal Global Framework on Biodiversity is a victory for all of humanity. Since 2015, our government has worked hard to protect an additional 300,000 square kilometers and protect endangered species, and that work is just starting.
L'opposition. So, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has caused the mortgage crisis we now face. Back in 2021, 2022, he flooded the economy with cheap and excessive cash. That went into the mortgage system. It bid up the price of housing. House prices had doubled under his leadership. Then Canadians were forced to take on massive, in some case, million-dollar mortgages in order to buy a home. He promised them rates would be low for long, but then his deficits juiced inflation, which pushed up interest rates. And now over the next 3 years, many of those same families will face 40% increases in their mortgage payments. How is he going to save their homes now that he put them in peril?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
2021, 2022. What was happening around then? What was happening in 2020, 2021? The investments we made to help Canadians get through the pandemic, the investments we made to support small businesses, to support our frontline health workers, to ensure that we got through this extraordinarily difficult time in one of the best situations with some of the fewest deaths of all of our peer countries. and the Conservative Party continues to say they would have done far different. They would have allowed people to be more vulnerable. They wouldn't have been there to support Canadians.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
2021, 2022, I'll tell you what was happening. I'll tell you what he was doing. He was trying to stuff $500 million into the We Charity to help a group that had paid off his family. We know that he gave money to Frank Bayless's company. We know that 40% of all the deficits he added had nothing to do with COVID, according to the PBO. We know he added $100 billion of debt before COVID ever happened, and now he's adding hundreds of billions more now that COVID is done. So he's got to stop using the COVID excuse and start answering the question. People don't know how they're going to pay their mortgages. That's why I've had to ask 20 times about that question. Will he finally answer it? How will they pay their mortgages?
Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, over the past years, we've been investing in Canadians in targeted, non-inflationary ways with things like a doubling of the GST credit, with dental supports for families under 12, with investments that have cut childcare fees in half, Mr. Speaker. These are all things that the Conservative Party stands against and indeed says they would cut. And I ask you, Mr. Speaker, and them through, how would cutting programs for Canadians help them in this difficult time?
Leader of the Opposition.
Let me break it down. I've been trying with 20 questions to get him to understand. Here's the domino effect. His spending causes deficits, which cause inflation, which cause interest rates to go up, which cause defaults. How do you reverse that? You stop the deficits, which stops the inflation, which stops the interest rates from going up, which stops the defaults. What part of that doesn't he understand?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, once again, never letting the facts get in the way of a good political argument is the Leader of the Opposition's modus operandi. He says if we were to raise childcare fees in Canada instead of cutting them in half, if we were to not deliver dental care for young kids across this country, then suddenly inflation, which is impacting the world all over, would suddenly drop. That Canada is so important in the world that our lowest deficits in the GDP are contributing massively to this global inflation context. It is complete garbage from the Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Speaker.
We started off fairly well, but it's deteriorating here. I just want to, I want to remind, order. I just want to remind the honourable members to use their words judiciously when they're using them in the House and try to use parliamentary language. The honourable member for St. John's East.
Mr. Speaker, our government believes that close collaboration with our provincial and territorial counterparts is essential. When we put partisan differences aside and the interests of Canadians first, anything is possible. I understand that the Minister of Rural Economic Development was in Newfoundland and Labrador last week, hosting a federal, provincial, territorial meeting on rural economic development. Can the Prime Minister share with the House the significance of this meeting and what it means for rural Canadians?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the member for St. John's East for her question and her hard work. Last week in Newfoundland, we hosted the first ever FBT meeting dedicated to building strong and thriving rural communities. Joined by Indigenous leaders and rural experts, they discussed how to continue building a collaborative, coordinated approach to helping rural communities succeed. Whether it be on connectivity, on workforce issues, or on climate resilience, we owe it to Canadians to work together. When we do, we can make transformational changes to all communities, and that's what we will continue to do.
Honourable member for Burnaby South.
Punjabi international students who place their trust in unscrupulous consultants in India have been defrauded and are now facing the devastating consequences of deportation. I'll be asking for a unanimous consent motion later on to support these students, but my question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister stay the deportation of all these students that are impacted and provide a pathway to permanent residency for these students?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we are deeply aware of cases of international students facing removal orders over fraudulent college acceptance letters. To be clear, our focus is on identifying the culprits, not penalizing the victims. Victims of fraud will have an opportunity to demonstrate their situation and present evidence to support their case. We recognize the immense contributions international students bring to our country, and we remain committed to supporting victims of fraud as we evaluate each case.
Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister is right about this one thing. Climate change is real, but the policies of the current government do not meet the requirements of the moment. We're in a climate emergency. Our eyes are burning in this place. The parliamentary Ottawa bubble has been pierced by the forest fires across this country, and yet in this place, the debates are inane. Please, will the Prime Minister commit to cancelling the Trans Mountain Pipeline, protecting the northeastern slope of Newfoundland from oil and gas development now?
Let's go.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I agree with my honourable colleague that it is unfortunate that in this House we continue to have to debate over whether or not climate change is real. It is unfortunate that the Conservative opposition still stands against any climate action. We should be discussing the best way to protect future generations from the impacts of climate change. We should be talking about competing, ambitious plans to do even more to build strong economies, to create great jobs and fight climate change. Unfortunately, the Conservatives continue to debate whether it's happening at all.
Hear, hear. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for question period today. I wish to draw the attention of the members to the presence in the gallery of the Honourable Ann Kang, Minister of Municipal Affairs for the province of British Columbia. I also wish to draw the attention of members to the presence in the gallery of the Honourable Don McMorris, Minister of Government Relations for the province of Saskatchewan. Mr. Singh? I believe the Honourable Member for Inna-2, alors je vais prendre...
I will start at the end, the Honourable Member for...
Why am I drawing a blank? Burnaby South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if you seek it, I believe you'll find unanimous consent for the following motion. That given that a group of Punjabi international students have been defrauded and now facing devastating consequences of potential deportation, the House call on the government to immediately stay the deportation of all affected students, waive inadmissibility on the basis of misrepresentation, and provide a pathway to permanent residency to the defrauded Punjabi international students currently facing deportation.
Hear, hear. All those opposed to the Honourable Member moving the motion will please say nay. Nay, I am sorry we don't have agreement on this one. L'Honourable Député.
The Honourable Member for La Prairie, point of order. On Wednesday, the Prime Minister is here to answer questions, and we appreciate the fact that he's here. He answers to all questions, but he doesn't actually answer the questions. There's a certain limit when it comes to skirting questions. We asked 2 questions about interference, and he talked about forest fires. I would like that there be a bit more of a serious tone to question period so that it be a question of answer period as well. That's more of a comment than a point of order. As it is 3:26, pursuant to order made earlier today, the House will now proceed to the taking of the deferred recorded division on the motion to concur in the 14th report of the Standing Committee on Health concerning the extension of time to consider Bill C-293.
Call in in the members.